ran out of ballots, and there were people already lined up wanting to vote at this polling place. When it was announced that they'd run out of ballots, the poor washerwomen and workmen were frightened to death. They said, "Oh, we've got to vote. We've got to vote. We've got to have our clipped voting card." So, in balance, we had a government elected with little more than a third of the vote, hailed by the United States Johnson administration as being a popular and legitimate government. Nearly two-thirds of the people voting against it, and even that 35%, of course, being to a considerable extent a result of fraud and intimidation.
Ai hát ngoài kia như mật vào tai, ai hát ngoài kia nghe ngọt ngào thấy.
Ai đứng trong ai nhân ai một vài lời, lời này thì ví đêm dài, tình này là khúc xuân vầy.
Anh với lòng em như một dòng sông, Nam Bắc cùng chung chung tình đại dương. Tay bắt tay nhau thương nhau mặn nồng mà, tin rằng cuộc sống muôn đẹp, lòng thương một phút cuối cùng.
It was bad enough for the generals to get away with double voting and ballot box stuffing, but to have the American observers say that they thought it was all fine and dandy made Vietnamese very mad indeed. There were efforts to protest election fraud. There were student demonstrations. And as a matter of fact, at one point it almost looked as if the election would be invalidated.
What I think we've come to, and what I think the tragedy of Vietnam clearly demonstrates, is that we now find ourselves in a world in which the arrangements of power cannot yet be ignored, but in which the instruments of power no longer work. If this lesson has been taught us in Vietnam, then the stubborn little guerrillas out there who sawed off the American giant at the knees and brought him down, almost like David versus Goliath, will have done a great service not only to their own cause, whatever one may think about it, but perhaps to the cause of world peace, and perhaps most particularly to the Colossus himself. Maybe we needed to be brought up short. Maybe what we've been doing in Vietnam all along is an exercise in what Senator Fulbright has called the arrogance of power.
We cannot retreat from any place, and I can tell you that we don't intend to retreat.
We were asked by the State Department to prepare a letter and send it to Ho Chi Minh through a channel which had been opened and was available to us. We were certain would deliver the letter directly to him. It was a very conciliatory letter written in the State Department in consultation, word by word, with Secretary Bundy, Secretary Katzenbach, and others, in which we spoke on behalf, this was the actual phraseology, on behalf of high officials of the State Department.
All of Asia, free Asia, as well as communist Asia, is watching Vietnam. And if, for example, out of this present struggle, after making this great commitment, after turning around the psychology in Asia, we then agree to a coalition government with the communists, or we force the South Vietnamese into a neutralized position, neutralize it as we did Laos, or if we make any kind of territorial concessions to the Viet Cong, either one of these three courses of action would be interpreted as a retreat and also a defeat, not only for South Vietnam, but for the United States.
We had an extended interview, almost 2 hours, with Ho Chi Minh. It was perfectly clear in the course of that interview that Ho Chi Minh was delivering to us certain information he expected us to deliver back to the State Department.
And on the side of Ho Chi Minh, understand that first of all, he will bring to the negotiation the prestige of an unparalleled life of devotion to his country. In the history of this century, he will be the great patriot. And be careful here. Don't forget that he is a Marxist. And don't expect him to turn a traitor to the ideal of his life.
He was unyielding on the point that the bombing had to halt before his negotiators would enter into any kind of substantive discussions. But I think he was trying to make the point, making it repeatedly, that after that the agenda was open.
Now there may be those who say, well, obviously, and you haven't offered them enough. Well, it's true that we haven't offered them South Vietnam. And it is true that we have not agreed to assure them that we will stop the bombing on a permanent and unconditional basis.
We discovered sometime later, when the correspondence was made public by Hanoi, that 4 days before our letter could arrive in Hanoi, a letter arrived there sent over President Johnson's signature, which was a very hard-line letter indeed, which restated all the previous conditions regarding cessation of the bombing and even added some new ones, and which was, in our judgment, intended to do what it did do, which was to break off any possibility of negotiation at that time. This letter, we subsequently learned, had been written 2 days before ours was written in conjunction with the State Department. We found to our surprise and shock, I might say, that Harriman was already saying that he proposed to negotiate the settlement by suggesting that there had to be some reciprocal military action in return for the final cessation of the bombing. In other words, the same point that Johnson had been standing on before he made the speech of March 31st. It was almost as though Harriman turned off his hearing aid when we told him that this would not work. This was not the understanding the North Vietnamese had, and they would certainly repudiate it if he attempted to take that position at the bargaining table. And this, of course, is what did happen at Paris.
In the view of the North Vietnamese, the reciprocity means the United States is bombing North Vietnam and North Vietnam must bomb the United States. This, in their view, is reciprocity. Since North Vietnam is not bombing the United States should not bomb North Vietnam.
The general impression that I came away with, and I think here I would speak for my colleague Bill Baggs, was that we were dealing with the State Department on a basis of what we have come to call Fulbright's Law, never trust the State Department.
Bombing is going on in the South. We haven't bombed anybody's embassy in Hanoi, but they've bombed our embassy in Saigon. Arms continue to flow, men continue to come. We've tried all over the earth to find an answer to the question, what else would stop if the bombing stopped?
The niceties of the argument about whether there are 2 Vietnams or 1 Vietnam seem quite inconsequential when you're talking to Ho Chi Minh. It would seem incredible that this man does not speak for most of the Vietnamese, not all, but most. And the idea that there could be some arbitrary geographic dividing line that would cut off his influence has been proved an absurdity by the vigor and determination of the National Liberation Front that fights in his name in the South.
My name's Olivier Todd. I'm a journalist on the non-communist, liberal, left-wing French paper Le Nouvel Observateur. I first went to South Vietnam when escalation started in 1965, and I first went to North Vietnam at the end of 1967.
I'm Harrison Salisbury of the New York Times, assistant managing editor of the Times.
I'm Farley Daniel Berrigan. I'm working here at Cornell teaching and helping with the peace movement. It's about 1 month since I was in North Vietnam on a project to get the 3 American flyers out.
At the time I went to North Vietnam, the communiques which were being issued by Washington in particular about the American bombing raids on the North gave the impression, although they did not say so specifically, that we were not killing civilians in any substantial numbers, at least, in the course of our very heavy bombing offensive. Indeed, President Johnson himself said that the targets were steel and concrete. I think almost anyone familiar with war would have been somewhat skeptical of the ability to bomb with such precision, and indeed, when I got on the spot in North Vietnam, I discovered, of course, that while the bombs presumably had been aimed toward military objectives as best the aviators could aim them, they indeed did kill many civilians, demolished large areas of civilian housing.
Before I left for North Vietnam, I was under the impression that it was a small country that was just sort of vaguely fighting back. But after seeing many battles against American planes from the banks of the Red River, I changed my opinions completely. The anti-aircraft in North Vietnam, in certain pockets, as the American pilots say, is absolutely formidable. It's a sort of four-level affair. You have people equipped with submachine guns and rifles shooting at a first level, forcing the planes to go up to a second level, where there they come against the machine guns, a lot of them being Chinese. And then they're forced up to a third level, which is that of the ordinary guns, most of them, I would say, Russian. And after that, they go up to a level where they meet the SAMs. And I had been told that these SAMs were antiquated. Well, in fact, they're not. They're formidably powerful. During 1 week in October, I saw at least 11 planes in 5 days being shot by the North Vietnamese anti-aircraft defense.
When you walk about the streets of Hanoi, you are struck by the fact that you constantly see civilians going about in trucks with guns in their arms, or even walking down the streets with guns strapped to their back. It's unusual to see so many people with guns in their hands, and it's most unusual to see this in a communist country.
One evening, on the road to Haiphong, we were bombed 300 yards from where we were. And with my interpreter, we immediately went onto the side road. I was very frightened. I was terribly frightened. But as soon as we bumped into a machine gun nest, fear disappeared. And the government has understood this, and I think this is one of the reasons why it has armed most of the population.
We went into the countryside, and we saw great evidence in the cities as well that the people are generally armed. The civilian militia is very large. The women share, for instance, the burden of anti-aircraft gunfire, defense of the city. We saw large numbers of men and women on the roofs of buildings preparing in the early stages of air alarms for the bombardment itself. And they said to us quite openly on several occasions, look, one of the most practical evidences of the truth that this government speaks for us is that the government has armed us. To the point where if we wanted, we could bring the government down in a day. And they themselves know this.
At the time that I was in North Vietnam, there obviously had not been any breaking of the morale of the people, either in the cities or, as far as I could observe, out in the villages, although they had been subjected to an extremely heavy bombardment. At that time, it was reaching the levels of World War II, and of course, since that time, it's been much strengthened. The people of North Vietnam are young for the most part, and the war effort is largely on the backs of teenagers, not because they're running out of manpower, but because this is a young country.
There is nothing that has not been attacked. There is no thread that has not been tried to be burned or frayed or broken by us, and yet none of it has happened or it's been repaired in the night.
Altogether, I think one can say, objectively, that there isn't a town left standing apart from Haiphong and Hanoi.
So that there are hospitals, there are schools, there is a trusted government, and there are political leaders whom they don't hesitate to call loved and admired. Which is to say, the war is not working. It's a very simple judgment, too simple for the complexities of our power. Perhaps in a deeper spiritual sense, too tough to face, because it means the end of the giant. It means the last days of Superman. It means that for those with the capacity of overkill, kill is not enough. The real thing required is to live in the real world. As Buber says, it is to be able to imagine the real world and imagine human beings. And as long as the dinosaur couldn't do it, he ended up on the museum shelf. And as long as Superman can't do it, he can raven and destroy, but he cannot give life, and he cannot even truly, as we know so bitterly, he cannot live himself.
The North Vietnamese always insist that they are winning this war, that they are not simply resisting. And when I talked to Prime Minister Pham Van Dong, he said, we are not under-bombing, we are facing the bombs. And at first I thought that this was mere propaganda, but seeing the North Vietnamese fighting in the country and in the towns, I think that psychologically it is true.
I was most interested to find that when I got to Hanoi, the authorities put no restrictions on what I wanted to send out. Prime Minister Pham Van Dong stressed in his talk with me the parallel between the ancient struggles of the Vietnamese people against the Chinese, the Manchus, and the Mongols, and their contemporary struggles for independence, which began, of course, under the French many years ago, were continued without interruption through World War II, then resumed again against the French, and are now being carried on against the Americans. Prime Minister Pham Van Dong turned to me at one point and said, Mr. Salisbury, how long do you want to fight? Would you like to fight for 10 years, 20, or 30? You pick the term of years. We're ready to accommodate you. A rather bold statement, and maybe it had some bravado in it, but this is, again, in accordance with the spirit of the Vietnamese people.
There's no one in that society who doesn't remember hunger in his own lifetime. And it was interesting that from the peasants to the young intellectuals, when you posed the very same question, that is to say, what has the revolution meant first of all to you, you will get the same answer. We now have enough to eat. As simple as that. So that when the North Vietnamese government makes it its pledge of honor that the rice bowl will be filled, this is so great a thing that we can hardly conceive of it. It just seems to be off our radar. I think, for them, the question is, first of all, a very, very concrete one. That statement is literally true. And then again, it begins to move into the larger areas. The circumference of the bowl expands, and you note that the revolution has meant a passion for education, a passion for grassroots involvement in their own future, their own social structures, their own politics. And that at the other end of that power, which they are trying to move upward after so many, many years of colonial powerlessness, at the other end of that power is standing a man who also has a rice bowl in his hand, and whose poverty is equivalent, whose power has not separated himself from the fate of the majority, who can move in the same cheap cotton clothing and with dignity among them, and whose power is not an inferior backroom game, or a game of marked cards under a table, or a corrupt double talk such as we've gotten so used to in the chanceries of the West.
Yet there is one light of hope, and this is that throughout Vietnamese history, they had catastrophes. They had Chinese, Mongolians invasions, where whole provinces were destroyed. Because, you are not the first people who destroy villages in Vietnam, unfortunately. And so they are used to that. And it's a great tradition that the village is not lost, even when it disappears from the surface of the ground, because the village is down below with the tradition, down below with the people, the ancestors who have made the country, literally. The country is handmade. There is not one square foot, I would say, a square thumb of the earth that has not been built as it is by the peasantry in the past. And this survives. And when it after 100 years, a village comes back, the descendants of a village come back to the village, they find the village, and the village starts again.